Yeah, I'm ready whenever you are. You tell me when you are live streaming, okay?
Sure. Okay, we're good. Okay, we're good.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the V2V thematic webinar series today. My name is Pradeep Nayak, and I'm representing B2B Global Partnership here, and I will be hosting this event. Before we go into our talk today, I'm going to make a couple of introductions to the partnership that is hosting this webinar, and I will introduce our speaker of today before we go to the talk. So a little bit about the B2B Global Partnership. B2B Global Partnership is a transdisciplinary research and knowledge network with over 100 members from Africa, Asia, Canada, and internationally. The goal of the partnership is to support small-scale fisheries in their transition from vulnerability to viability. And the way we understand vulnerability and viability are not just in the economic sense, but it includes, cultural, political, and all other spheres of human life. So it is more inclusive than just one sphere of human life. The V2B Global Partnership aims to identify the diverse factors and conditions contributing to the vulnerability of small-scale fisheries and fishers, and engage collaboratively with small-scale fishing communities around the world and other key NGOs, governments, university partners to enhance SSF viability. Just give me a sec, please. We are conducting, as part of the partnership, transdisciplinary community engaged research in 6 countries in Asia. That includes Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, and Thailand, and 6 countries in Africa. That includes Ghana, Malawi, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania. In doing so, the V2V partnership brings people and organizations together across physical, cultural, and disciplinary boundaries through a shared interest in addressing global change impacts on small-scale fisheries. Coming to the specific event of today, the V2B thematic webinar series is an initiative of the V2B Global Partnership to facilitate and generate high-level discussions on viability and vulnerability themes and topics within the context of small-scale fisheries. The goal here is to feature academics, policy practitioners, and members of the civil society who have made significant contributions to the theoretical, practical, and policy aspects of small-scale fisheries, both locally and globally. Our V2B thematic webinar series takes place on the last Friday of every month through 2021. The series is available internationally through live streaming on YouTube. Details regarding the monthly webinar series, including speakers, topics, and titles, and links to the webinar platforms is available on our website at www.v2bglobalpartnership.org. Today's talk is the 5th in the series of webinars this year, which is planned for the year 2021, of course. And it is my privilege to introduce Dr. Martin Wavink as our distinguished speaker for today's talk. Dr. Wavink is a professor of coastal resource governance at the University of Amsterdam in the Department of Geography. Martin is a co-director of the Center for Maritime Research, that is called MARA, and chair of the board of the International Collective in Support of Fish Workers, in short form ICSF. Dr. Wavink is an editor of the MARA book publication series and associate editor of the journal Maritime Studies, which is called MAST. Martin grew up in India and Sri Lanka and studied development sociology at the Free University of Amsterdam. His first field work was on the coastal social organization and history of a fishing village in northern Sri Lanka, which brought him into the fisheries field. And I personally know that Martin revisited the same community after a few decades, a couple of years back. He was so excited and interacting and getting back in touch with the research community after decades of time. Years later, Martin completed a PhD in human geography on the conflicts occurring in the fisheries of the Coromandel coast in South India. And ever since, he has been busy and focusing his work in South Asia mostly, but with meaningful involvement in the small-scale fisheries sector of South and West Africa. Dr. Bhavink is a global leader in the area of interactive governance and legal pluralism. He examines the small-scale rural fishing communities that have developed their own laws to regulate their use of space and resources, and promoting innovative and interactive bottom-up governance in a context of multiple actors, levels, and complexities. And we all know Martin's co-authored book, which is titled as Fish for Life, that was published in 2005. It's almost like a Bible in interactive governance theory, and we have all read about it. He has authored numerous books and articles on these topics. It is my honor today to invite Dr. Martin Bhavink to deliver a talk for the V2B Global Partnership thematic webinar series. And Martin's talk is titled as Is Legal Pluralism a Bane or a Boon for Small-Scale Fishing Communities? So please join me in welcoming Dr. Martin Bhavink to deliver the talk today. Martin, over to you.
Thanks, Prateep, for this nice introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very sorry that I can't see you on screen. I imagine that you are both young and old, that you are academics, that you are practitioners, and that we are united, I guess, in our interest in the situation of small-scale fisher people and in the topic of legal pluralism, to which I hope I can introduce you a bit more. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak on this topic, because it has been central to my professional life for many years now. Let me start by saying something about my sources of inspiration and my approach. As far as my inspiration is concerned, this originated very much in my field work among fishers in South Asia, and has continued. I've been continuing this kind of work in the past decades, not only there, but also, as Prateep mentioned, in South and Western Africa. The interesting thing for me, if I look back, is that legal pluralism was not part of my research plan at all when I started my PhD in 1994. But that the reality of legal pluralism actually imposed itself on me in the course of my more than 1 year study. Having been struck by the evidence of different systems of law prevailing in the fisheries and influencing the way the conflicts that were emerging between small and other kinds of fisheries were developing, I then connected to the scholarship that has developed in this field and is gathered especially within the International Commission on Legal Pluralism. And you will see in a few slides time, you will see reference to this important organization. So I'm very much indebted to the scholars in that tradition, but I have also been trying to connect, let's say, legal pluralism studies also to interactive governance. And you will see some signs of this in what follows. Okay, so that is how I got interested in legal pluralism. As for my conceptual approach, you could say that, now I'm going to use the interactive governance perspective. Just wait. No, maybe I should show you this first. These are some pictures from my own fieldwork experience in Southeast India. The top left, I like that picture particularly because it shows how lively small-scale fisheries actually is. This is a beach I think close to Nagapattinam in Tamil Nadu. And this whole beach is full of small-scale fishermen returning from the sea. On the right, you see a more traditional fishing operation. Bottom left, you see fishers lining up for the auction. This is a very organized process, also governed by customary law. And the women you will see at the back because they are the main participants in this auction. Then bottom right, you will see a village council meeting taking place. You will note, of course, the fact that the men are the ones who represent village population, but it is about councils like this that a lot of my research has been interested in, and in the importance of councils of this kind for the fishing population of that whole region. Okay, let's now go to the conceptual approach. In terms of interactive governance, you would say that fisheries constitutes a societal field in which it is useful to think of it being constituted by a system to be governed. At the bottom here, the system to be governed certainly in fisheries has a natural side to it and a human side to it. And you have a governing system in which law plays a very important role. And then law not in the form of, or not necessarily in the form of law books, etc., but law taken in a broader socio-legal sense. And law in this regard also can be, there are different aspects to law. So you could look at law from the perspective of the principles and the norms. You can look at it from the viewpoint of the institutions or the tools and instruments. So as law is part of every governing effort, in this lecture I will refer mainly to law and legal pluralism. So not so much to, for instance, governance, but I also want to recognize from the beginning that law also has connections with knowledge, with culture, with politics too. In short, law is not a separate but an integral part of any society to be viewed in relationship with other parts. Finally, I will be referring to law and legal systems as ideal types in the Weberian sense, meaning that I will be trying to draw out contrast between different legal systems. One of the issues I will not be able to pay adequate attention to is the change that always affects law and legal pluralism. The term living law, which is used in South Africa a lot, is in this respect appropriate, as it highlights the liveliness and the malleability that characterizes law and human societies the world over. So, in other words, law and legal pluralism is a very dynamic kind of thing. For those looking forward to my conclusion, I will be arguing that legal pluralism is a reality in most small-scale fisheries of the world, and whether it is a bane or a boon depends on the perspective of the onlooker as well as the circumstances available in different regions. For small-scale fishers, I will argue that customary law provides protection as well as a set of regulatory mechanisms that is not only familiar and adaptive to local circumstances, but legitimate as well. From the broader perspective of fisheries management, however, legal pluralism also provides problems, particularly in terms of fragmentation of management effort. And in that respect, co-management is a worthwhile approach for arriving at some kind of common governance strategy, which I think is also important in the fisheries field. Okay, I'll go on to the practice of fishing, about which I don't need to tell you very much. Fishing is the name given to the act of hunting for aquatic species in a common pool resource. And this resource is, of course, fluid, and target species, the fish, are frequently invisible and often moving about. The fisher makes use of a variety of technologies and skills, and is complemented onshore by a processor or a marketeer. And together they make a team. And often this team is made up of men or husband and wife. In the countries I know best, so India and Sri Lanka, small-scale fishers, both men and women, often live in separate communities along the coast, so separated from, let's say, the agricultural community. But this is not always the case. Sometimes small and large-scale fishers live adjacent to one another, and sometimes fishers share living space with farmers or people of other occupational categories. Okay, fishers, they make use of aquatic and terrestrial space and resources. They fish in certain areas for certain fish species and require land not only to live, but to beach their craft and dry their nets. And this is very important. So fishing rights, if we talk about fishing rights, are not only about aquatic space they are also about terrestrial space and resources. So left to themselves, fishers make use of available resources, of course, at sea, but also resources on land, such as drinking water from the wells or firewood from surrounding lands, etc. Importantly, they often have a low social status in society, and this works against them and creates specific problems also in the realm of legal pluralism, and I will return to that a little further down. Now we come to law. All societies, however simple they may be, possess bodies of law, norms, values, or rules that regulate social life. As Roberts points out, there are many societies that survive in a remarkably orderly fashion without the help of judges, law courts, and policemen. Speaking of how rural people relate to their surrounding natural environments, another author, Dalton in this case, adds by noting that resource allocation is never unstructured because continuity in the production of basic goods is never unimportant. In other words, all rural producers, including fishers, tend to develop some form of law to organize their work practice and their lives in a more general sense. So, for instance, consider the rules aiming to avoid conflicts over fishing spots, or to prevent the use of harmful fishing methods, to ensure some form of justice also within the community. Remember the norms that specify times of departure to and arrival from sea. These are useful for purposes of mutual assistance, such as the hauling of boats and for marketing. And such customary law or such norms are adaptive. They are also difficult to identify for a researcher because they are so much part and parcel of life that inhabitants, that fishers we engage with, do not think of them as being very special. Customary law is frequently unwritten, and the office bearers do not distinguish themselves from regular fishers. Kinship often plays a role in deciding who is appointed as an office bearer. Sanctions for the transgression of rules can be corporal, can involve physical punishment, and also make use of methods of social inclusion, such as even going to the extent people are excluded. If the transgression is too big, they may even be thrown out of local society. Legal pluralism occurs when different legal systems apply to identical situation. And this here you can see a representation of this condition, where the identical situation here is pictured as the common fish stock. But there may be different legal systems which actually play a role and have a say in what can happen to this fish stock, who is allowed to go for fishing, what kind of methods are you able to use, etc. So that is, you could say, in any particular fish spot, whether that is in South Asia or in other parts of the world, you have a horizontal fragmentation in that different legal systems can actually relate to these fish stocks and pretend that they have something to say about them. You may also have what we call vertical fragmentation, that you have local law, which is different from national law and international law, and all these legal systems can actually interfere with each other or interact with each other. The easiest way to picture legal pluralism is when a fishery and a fishing community that has developed its own form of customary law, let's say that customary law is legal system number one, that this community is also subjected to government law, to state law. This is the case also in India, where following independence in 1947, the new constitution claimed the right to regulate fisheries for itself, and for many different reasons ignored the existence of customary law. From that year on, from independence on, and you could actually trace it earlier, the fishing communities that had always lived by their own rules also became governed by the state. And year by year, the Indian state has expanded its reach, reducing the isolation affecting fishing communities and integrating them into larger society. So how has legal pluralism actually come about? And my argument is that now it is a very prevalent condition in small-scale fisheries around the world, while 50 years ago it was far less prevalent, and there was a bigger chance that fishers would be left to their own devices. The national state is not the only external entity to have affected the practice of fishing. Religious law, too, may play a role, as well as law imposed through certification processes, a very modern way of fisheries management, or the conservation activities of NGOs, which also have a legal context to them. The same is true for international law that is coming to affect local communities in a variety of ways. And the most interesting piece of international legislation in this regard, at least from a small-scale fisher viewpoint, is the voluntary guidelines on securing sustainable small-scale fisheries adopted by FAO in 2014. Making use of a human rights approach, these voluntary guidelines field principles that are not always in line with local fishing practice. So take, for example, the promotion of gender equity or the prohibition of child labor, neither of which is necessarily underwritten in the same way by fishing communities on the ground. Which law in this case is to have precedence, and why? And how is one to deal with the differences that can be signaled? It is undeniable, however, that the main reason for the rise of legal pluralism in small-scale fishing is the manifestation of the national state with all its tentacles and services. And let me illustrate this from my own long-term research among the Patinavar fishing population along the southeast coast of India. You saw some pictures of this fishing population at the start of my presentation now. The Patinavar occupy a 400-kilometer long string of fishing villages, some 250 fishing villages, and over the centuries have developed a complex law system that includes claims to aquatic and terrestrial space, criteria for citizenship with specified rights and responsibilities, tax systems, and rules on the avoidance of harmful fishing practice. And this is one of the things I have found very interesting and which I've spent a lot of time trying to understand. The Indian state duplicates all these aspects of customary law, denying customary claims to space, contradicting customary definitions of citizenship, imposing other systems of taxation, and providing other definitions of harmful fishing practice. So these two legal systems are hardly complementary to each other. They are often in stark contradiction. Such contradictions emerge in specific instances, such as when the government strives to provide tsunami relief to villagers according to its own list of community citizenship, while the local fisher council subsequently makes use of its own arrangement. It also comes out when a villager takes a village leader to court for having applied corporal punishment in response to a transgression, and the village leader is put into jail for having taken the law into his own hands. Most significantly in my own research, it comes out when the state protects large-scale fishers who are fishing in village waters, and the impunity of such transgressions, which according to customary law are harmful and unfair and should be disallowed, has resulted in large riots along the coasts of the Indian subcontinent in the past decades, and to continued tensions between the different legal systems and the different groups of fishers. Let's look at the possibility of legal pluralism being a boon or being advantageous. In our research on the contribution of civil society to the realization of the goals of the SSF guidelines, which took place in the Nagapattinam region in South India, Vivekanandan and I point out that fisher law is internally justified by reference to the well-being of the village population. Ideally speaking, the elected village council speaks justice according to local priorities and norms. Having intimate knowledge of the community, it provides the individual, take a young widow for instance, or the population as a whole, with support when hardship strikes. It settles quarrels over a variety of issues such as debts, land boundaries, and fishing practice. It decides on the eligibility of new fishing practice the moment it is introduced. And most importantly, in the context of legal pluralism, it is felt to be the protector of the village population, which is aware that it is only when the population acts as a group, when also it is mobilized in that direction by these village councils, that it has a chance of countering harmful influences. Protection is sometimes sought by insulating the population from the outside world. Don't take a case to the police. We must settle it ourselves. Don't go individually to the fisheries department. Let's make a joint statement on what we require. Let us take collective action against an aquaculture firm which is operating or which is opening its doors next to our fishing village. Let us make a rule prohibiting our villagers from working on large-scale fishing vessels so that they won't reveal the whereabouts of good fishing spots. And finally, most recently, none of us should go for COVID-19 vaccinations as we don't trust the substance with which we might be injected. Indeed, villagers frequently have good reason to be suspicious of many government plans, which take little account of local circumstances and are sometimes infused with other interests. Thus, the fishers of a fishing village I know well that was badly affected by the tsunami in 2004 were scarcely surprised when the government insisted that for reasons of their own safety, they should be moved to the interior, and their former village lands were subsequently given to a tourism operator. This is a good example of what Naomi Klein in 2008 called blanking the beach. The continued availability of fisher law can thus be argued to help small-scale fishers to protect themselves against what is sometimes considered a malicious outside world, as well as to fashion and follow their own norms and regulations with fit with their own ideas of fairness. Let us now look at a contrary perspective, namely legal pluralism as a bane or as an obstacle. Because legal pluralism does create obstacles, it creates difficulties for village leaders. If a villager who is convicted according to customary law turns to government law for reversal of an unfavorable verdict, it is painful as well when government officers, eager to implement a scheme that fits with their notions of fairness are faced with the collective wrath of a fishing population that wants things done in a different way. And most importantly, in the context of conservation and fisheries management, it does not help if perspectives on law and what is to be done differ so substantially between government agencies and the local fishing population. Thus, in our analysis of the relations between legal systems, Joyita Gupta and I a few years ago suggest that mutual support is only one possibility that occurs between legal systems, with indifference, conflict, and accommodation providing other very common options. So, harmonization of legal pluralism, what are the risks and the dilemmas? In most parts of the world, reversion to a condition of self-governed small-scale fishing villages is no longer possible. It is prevented, first of all, by the geopolitics of state building. Generally speaking, and in line with the scholarly writings of James Scott, who wrote a book called The Art of Not Being Governed, it is only when subjects collectively flee to remote regions that they can escape the domination of the state. Added to this is the realization among most stakeholders that addressing the troubled conditions of fisheries are in many ways in need of better governance. You also need the inputs of science, and you need coordination at higher scales, the region, the nation, and the globe as a whole. After all, local fisheries problems are intertwined with those at higher scale levels so that they cannot be addressed separately. How then can people deal with problems involving legal pluralism? Individuals in such societies, both fishers and local government officers, engage in a process that is termed forum shopping. They make use of the various legal systems to find the best way or the best solution to their problem. But for fisheries management to succeed, it must be consistent, and it must also be legitimate with most stakeholders. And it is for this reason that co-management is a very useful and maybe essential pathway. I am deliberately referring to co-management not as system or as structure, although it is both, but primarily as process. It is a process of bridging highly divergent legal systems and worldviews and slowly identifying common ground. It is a way of trying to overcome the distrust which is frequently there between local fishers and government officers and other people who come with their own new plans and ideas, and to slowly build towards some kind of common approach, which must be respectful and slow. As argued by Jentoft and co-authors in 2009, co-management must somehow make up for the added complexity that legal pluralism brings, for instance, by finding ways to reconcile legal differences, communicate them so that they are well known, and whenever possible, try to simplify them and make them easier to understand. Taking this perspective further, John Kurian has recently argued for the development and usage of what he calls intermediate institutions to provide an interface between fisher law and the state. Such institutions, like the Gram Panchayats that have been implemented in Kerala, India, provide a fruitful meeting ground for representatives of different legal traditions and possibilities for finding ways forward. I agree with his perspective, but would add that another kind of intermediate institution building too is often required. A building or rebuilding of customary law institutions at higher levels than the local, so as to deal with problems occurring at higher scale levels. My Indian colleague Vivekanandan, who I've mentioned already, is a tireless proponent of this approach, striving to rebuild the strength of customary village councils at the regional level in Tamil Nadu. Still, there are risks to co-management. After all, on whose conditions does co-management take place? Are fishers and fisher viewpoints, including those on law, provided sufficient acknowledgement? Does co-management actually result in blue justice being done? It is clear that, whatever the case may be, the recognition of fisher viewpoints requires what John Kurian refers to as constant struggle. After all, as we have seen, fishers, and certainly small-scale fishers, are frequently viewed as inferior, as marginal to society, and therefore also need to fight their case. The odds are great, but through force of numbers and by sticking together, small-scale fishers and their allies do make gains. Customary law provides them with an armor, a backbone, and a fuel that motivates engagement in the realm of legal pluralism. So let me turn to a few conclusions. Legal pluralism is, first of all, a reality. It is not something which needs to be imagined. It is right there on the ground. It characterizes small-scale fisheries the world over to greater or to lesser extents. By acknowledging its availability, we do justice to fact. But we also acknowledge that the differences between customary law, fisher law, and other legal systems are often substantial. They are not easy to diagnose or to understand, but they are important. In the words of Gregory Bates, they are differences that make a difference. They involve different worldviews, social realities, and knowledge sets. It takes sustained effort, like, for instance, the effort you need to learn another language or to marry into another culture to understand customary law and the interactions that take place with other legal systems. This is a pursuit that researchers like ourselves can perhaps contribute to. And small-scale fishers, with their allies, will, of course, continue to fight the fight, for better or for worse, for the challenges are, of course, substantial. And I would hereby like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to any questions you might have. Back to Prateep.
Thank you very much, Martin. That was a wonderful, set of perspectives on legal pluralism, and linking to some of your case studies from India and elsewhere. So we will open this up for our discussions now, and if you can see the questions, or I can read it. So one question is from Mondes Maris. I think Cornelia is writing this question. So
There are just comments. The beginning ones are just
comments. I lost track of the questions actually.
Oh, okay. Pradeep, I can help.
Okay, can you do that? No,
Yes.
Yeah.
So just going through the comments, Cornelia from Mundus Maris says hello. Anna Carolina says an interesting point on the play of legal pluralism in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. And then we have a question from Jenya Mukherjee. She says, you said that religious laws also determine small-scale fisheries in India. This is a very interesting point, how religion, gender, caste, ethnicity, etc. talk to the political economic processes. Can you please elaborate on religious legalism? And the conceptualization, street-level bureaucrats is interesting. Some more discussion on this. So maybe the first question first, the religious legalism.
Okay, let me try and react to some of these points. You can hear me still, I hope. Huh?
Yes.
And let's see, legal pluralism in the context of COVID. I must say that this is also a situation in which we still don't know enough. Also because COVID is making it very difficult for field work to take place. So we don't really know how it plays out. I'm reminded of other pandemics, however, which have taken place in the past, such as smallpox, and the fact that the goddess of smallpox, that many villages, many fishing villages, also have a goddess, a protective goddess, relating to smallpox. And it wouldn't surprise me if, in the course of time, we might actually get goddesses related to COVID. That is one possible expression. And we, in this context, it's also, I think it's important to note that in fishing practice, religion plays an enormously important role. And so for fishers going out to sea in South Asia, they are aware of the wind and the waves, and they have an idea of where they might be able to find fish. But they are also very much aware of the supernatural world, which is also there, of the spirits in the waters, which may be harmful, which may attach themselves to boats or to fish or to objects, and may drive fishers crazy or make them ill. They are aware of the fact that that there are certain magic things you can do to enhance your catch, and they are generally aware of that the gods also play an important role in whatever luck you may have. So the rituals, and there are numerous rituals of this kind, which on a village basis. So the fact that villages, and I'm talking again about South Asia, they all have their annual religious festivals celebrating their goddess. And these goddesses are expected, if you do it properly, these goddesses will also enhance the welfare of the village. So in other words, there's a strong connection between also the religious life, which has an influence on the bountifulness of nature. So nature is not only determined by what we do in terms of harmful fishing practices, yes or no. No, there's something else out there which determines whether you are in favor of the gods. And I know of villages that for many years do not organize festivals, and that they feel that they are suffering because of it, that they are not also having the good luck or the favor that they might otherwise have. Okay, so law, I think if you see society also as being connected between, let's say, the socioeconomics, the politics, but also the religious, then it's not surprising that law also stretches out to include religion. So for instance, in the villages that I'm most familiar with, one of the duties of village members, the people who are officially a member of the village, their names are registered and they pay taxes. But one of their responsibilities is to take charge of, in a rotating system, of the temple and the goddess. Okay, so that's part and parcel of the whole system. Whether we think in the West, it's certainly in Europe, Northwest Europe, where I'm located, we dissociate religion from, let's say, regular social life. And if we talk about fisheries management, we don't talk about religion. And I think we should actually be talking about it more. Certainly, if we want to understand how villagers themselves look at the world and at the way their societies function. Okay, that's maybe a start for talking about religious law. So regarding COVID, I do have evidence of villages in the southeast coast of India that have collectively said, we are not going to get vaccinated. We don't trust it. There are too many rumors of harmful substances, of manipulation, too many rumors of government incompetence. We just are not going to do it. Whether this will continue, whether this is a broad-based kind of thing or not, I can't tell yet. But it is evidence of, let's say, a style of decision-making which I find at the community level in South Asia that is very strong. So trying to decide things on a common basis and not on an individual basis. Why? Because they also realize that fishers, as being relatively marginal in society, if you are a single person, you won't be able to achieve much. But if you group together, you have many more possibilities of achieving something. And that is true at the village level. You can actually, and I have many examples of this, as a fishing village, you can actually make sure that if an aquaculture firm is set up next to your village, that they will actually contribute to your village fund every year. This is a simple example of how fishers, and this is in many cases also a voluntary contribution by these aquaculture firms, because they realize they need the goodwill of the fishers. But it is also a result of the pressure that fishers are able to impose on others around them, in line with their own ideas of who is actually the rightful claimant of the coast. Okay, and then maybe something short on street level bureaucrats. Now I forget the name of maybe Prateep can help me there. Is it White who has coined this as a very interesting book on street level bureaucrats? So basically the people who stand at the interface between society and government, is the police officers, the people in the counters of the welfare department, the people who take care of the fisheries department policy on the ground level. These people are kind of stuck because they get instructions from their superiors, but they also realize that not all these instructions can be carried out because they know, they have experience, they know that these instructions are sometimes objected to. So they have to find ways of dealing with this, which solves the problem at hand. So they have to find a kind of formulation which is acceptable to both sides. So I have good examples of how these street level bureaucrats actually pretend or act in line with fisher law, while they are actually government servants. But they do so because they also realize, look, we can't push through these government laws which are not felt to be fair or useful. Anyway, there's a nice literature on that. Please write to me if you want to know more. I will send you some literature. And now I'm seeing Muniba's. So nice, Muniba. Nice to realize that you're on the other side. Co-management as a process. Why do I say this? I think the basis of my saying this is that I realize that the trust between fishers and government authorities is frequently very low. And this goes both ways. The government officials, scientists, don't trust fishers. Often they also think of them as violent, drinking too much, ganging up too much. You also have to watch out. If you're a government servant, you go to a fishing village, you have to watch your steps. You have to watch what you're doing. And the other side is also true, that fishers also distrust government officials in a very big way. They think they don't know about fishing, they don't know about the sea, and they are not always really concerned about fisher welfare. So there's an enormous amount of distrust both ways. And to build some kind of platform in which there is an equality there, or there is a willingness to listen to each other and to also take each other's perspectives into consideration, is a long-term process. And this is also a critique of many fishing, or many projects, let's say, in the fishing field. They are often limited to short periods of time. If you have 3 or 4 years, you are lucky. While I think this kind of processes actually take place over maybe decades. So it needs time to build trust, to build a basis, and to start to conceive of a collective way forward. I hope this may be something for you, Muniba. Religious, yeah, please.
Sorry, I was just going to read the question.
Okay, go ahead.
Another question from Raktima is, thank you for this excellent talk. Could you please suggest some references on or around religious legalism in the context of dry fish production in South Asia, India?
That's a complicated question. Dry fish production in itself is already a very separate field, and I know, and I'm somewhat part of this Dried Fish Matters project. Which is, I think, is important also, certainly in a historical sense, because dry fish production has been very important in the past, certainly in South Asia. It is still there. It still plays an important role. To what extent religious legalism would play a role there, I'm not sure about that. Of course, you had in dry fish production, but that's not legal so much as colonial, that the British government was always concerned about reserving the right to produce salt. And salt is essential for dry fish production. So you could, let's say, look at dry fish production in South Asia, certainly, from the viewpoint of how did these different legal systems come together. But I have never done any research on this myself, so I can't tell you much more.
Another question from Cornelia and Mundus Maris. She says, do you envision any advantage of striving to retake more local control compared to the emphasis on globalization we observe in the last decades?
Thanks, Cornelia, I think, or this Cornelia or Aliou, I'm not sure who this is. Thanks for this question. It's an important question because on the one hand, you note the process of globalization, which has a strong economic side to it, has a political side to it, but it also has a legal side to it. We're seeing at the global level more and more initiatives are being taken to frame international law for regulating fisheries and coastal developments in a more general sense. And these international instruments are brought to bear on local circumstances. And the question is, how does this affect local dynamics also? And how does this affect local control over, let's say, local life and also local fishing? And this is a topic, so Svein Jentoft and I have been trying to write about this topic, also about the meeting of the voluntary guidelines for small-scale fisheries and customary law at the local level. And we also have some disagreement about this, because you could say, look, international law, I think the voluntary guidelines are in many ways a very good kind of instrument, very favorable to small-scale fishers. And it also provides, if you look at the principle, a lot of space for recognition for local culture and local, it doesn't mention local law, but in any case, local culture. But if you look at some of the specifics which are being recommended also by the voluntary guideline, there are issues in which it doesn't always correspond with what is held to be important at the local level. So in one of our last articles, we were looking at a few aspects such as the equal rights for the gender rights and calls for child labor. And one more thing, I forget what that was. But in this case, you can see at least that in many small-scale fishing communities, gender equity is perceived perhaps in a different way than we would do so at an international level, or that we as international scholars would possibly want to do so. And the same is true for child labor. Child labor is, in a sense, essential to becoming a fisher. You become a good fisher by starting very early, if whether you are a boy or a girl. So I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but I agree with Cornelia or Aliou that having local control and that we should not let international viewpoints take over all the time. You know, I think we are also trying to develop a management system and a legal regime which pays significant attention to what is held to be important at the local level. So in that sense, I would definitely see it as an important point on the agenda, that making sure that in new management and governance practices, that local control is included as a very important element. I don't know what Pratib would say.
I mean, it goes both ways sometimes, you know, so there could be excess of, you know, both local control or the government, you know, the control from the other levels, you know, so and depending on what kind of, you know, interference happens from what level, you know, social movements and other kinds of protests from a community perspective takes place, you know. So we have seen extremes in both levels, extreme government control, and also a kind of a, you know, some people have written about it, you know, in terms of you know, how you know, romanticizing community control and community you know, governance may not be the right thing in all contexts, you know. So from a scholarly point of view, you know, we need to be aware of both these realities, because it's a very fine line, you know. It might, you know, just go into any of those, you know, extremes at any point, you know. So but you know, in view of that, we should not also be neglecting the real possibilities, you know, communities taking control and doing an amazing job, and which is a reality in many places. But at the same time, some governments at different levels are also doing an amazing job, you know. So we just don't know, you know, where they are exactly, you know, and we know some of the cases where they are being done that way. So that's why we need to be kind of, you know, aware. We need to be not overtly critical of one way of doing things or the other way. So government is not perennially bad, or communities are not perennially good, or something like that, you know. So we are caught up in this tussle of, you know, finding the good and the bad and navigating our way through that process.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and also with the fact that you should not romanticize customary law, which can also be quite violent in at some points of time or some moments.
Yeah.
But I think well, I started pointing out also the importance of change, and you see that this customary law is also changing in many ways. So, for instance, in the coastline I have been working in, the village leaders used to be an inherited position, used to be passed on from father to son in principle, and you would basically serve in that position for your whole lifetime. What you see now, since the past few decades, is that this has become an inherited thing, and this is something which has gone from one village to the other. It's basically the whole string of villages down the coast now has a form of democratic governance. They are inherited or they are elected position. And then you could say, okay, how about the position of women? And as you saw in my first picture with the village council, it's generally a male-based kind of thing. With women, if they take part, they are there in the second row. They are there and to the back, and they do not normally speak out. And it is basically the males who are expected to speak out on behalf of the women. This is in itself, and I don't want to justify the situation because it has a certain history and a certain culture to it. At the same time, if you realize that many of the women in the village are actually married into the village. They are people who come from other places. They're married into the village. And from that perspective, it's not, you could also say it is logical, perhaps, that people who are born there would have something more to say than, anyway, but I don't want to justify that. I think in due course, you will see that women also achieve their place in this, a different place also in customary law. But I'm also reluctant to try to push this on villages. I think this is something they have to realize themselves. They have to do themselves. It has to come from within. And it should not be that the NGOs say, you should do this and should do that, because that will also fail. I know in the case of the tsunami, some NGOs were actually pushing for better women representation. They were giving women boats to manage. And many of these boats just moved back into the hands of the men because that's the way that the culture worked at that point of time. Anyway, so I agree with Pratib that it needs time. These things also change over time. And you shouldn't romanticize either way, either saying that government is bad or that customary law is necessarily good. But what I do see is that customary law has been so consistently pushed aside. And in the Indian context, this is also related to a view of caste. So the Indian constitution was very much formulated in terms of trying to get rid of caste, trying to get rid of caste influence, trying to move caste and caste institutions to the background. And maybe you could say maybe the tragedy of some of these fishery councils that are very good in fisheries management, they are relegated or they are seen as caste councils, and as such they are not given sufficient attention. I'm not sure that the same would be true, for instance, in West Africa, where you still have very strong customary institutions around the chiefs, the fisher chiefs, etc. But there too, there is a sense that in modern society, this kind of institutions should not play too much of a role. And it sometimes makes it difficult for this kind of these institutions to be given recognition in a way that I think would be more appropriate.
Yeah. But at the same time, there's a lot of cooptation that happens. The community level processes, the customary processes, and not only law but other associated institutions and everything has been co-opted into more formal. So there's a lot of argument that can be done in terms of what is good, what is formal, what is informal, and are village institutions always informal? They are not, probably, because in their own context they are very formal. So it's not only law that brings the formality part. So there's a lot of churning that needs to be happen at that level. We have not resolved it, but at the same time, these are all dynamic systems. The pattern of gender leadership has been really changing in places where there is large-scale migration. All the men out in the city, women have taken leadership. So if we can look at this process as part of a dynamic system also, because any crisis, any change brings changes in the not only in the thinking process, but also in the leadership and all the other material aspects of people's life.
And I think yeah, can I continue on this for a
Yes,
moment?
please. Yeah.
Because you're right that in real practice you see these systems being interconnected in all kinds of ways, and maybe in some ways also starting to resemble each other. If I talk about democracy affecting the fishing villages of Tamil Nadu, and I think that it has moved in this direction also because it is patterning itself on a political system in which democracy is important. But it is also patterning itself in ways which are maybe less favorable, like also, let's say, the corruption affecting politics in South Asia, and that you see the same thing coming up at the village level.
Yeah.
So I recognize this interconnection, and at the same time, certainly from a social science viewpoint, I think it's very important to also realize that although these things are becoming more interconnected, that they have started out as being different. The village law, the fishery law, has a completely different origin, and in many ways has different precepts and principles and ways of working than government law. And although they are connecting more and more, it is important to realize to understand the substance of difference.
Yeah. Yeah. Derek had a question or two. I see that Derek is on the Zoom link here. Derek, if you are there, would you like to ask your question, please?
Sure. Thanks, Prateep, and thanks, Martin. This has been a really interesting talk and a conversation too, and some great questions. I found what was really interesting was that typology that you showed about the relation between legal systems, sort of from the indifference to the mutual support. And I was just wondering, like, what are the actual experiences on the ground globally? I mean, to what extent are we seeing, is it mostly examples of indifference, or there are some examples out there where it is about mutual support? And so to what extent does the world fit into that typology, I guess, is my question. And therefore, what are the implications for how we can approach small scale fishery challenges? Anyway, it's a really interesting typology.
What the students I've had who have been working with this typology, they often end up coming back from a field situation or analyzing their data and saying, well, we actually find all four of these kind of relationships there, right? So sometimes in some conditions, there's a relation of, there are conflicts taking place, then there are situations that there are kind of ships passing in the night, but also accommodation and even mutual support. So, I mean, it depends a little on the level at which you want to look at it. So if you look at specific, let's say, specific fields over a certain time period, you can see that relations shift from one into the other. Mm-hmm. And that they can start off being conflictive and then being more accommodative and then going back to conflict and whatever. What I find very interesting, and I don't know if you would recognize the same thing, is that the whole modernization of fisheries. So let's say the first blue revolution, the introduction of industrial fisheries and so on, has created enormous conflicts in many parts of the world between large-scale and small-scale fisheries. And what you tend to see, or so you see also governments being brought into that, because there's a lot of violence involved. There's boats being burned, there's people getting killed, and so on. And then governments get involved and they send the police, but they do that only once in a while because it takes a lot of effort and money to gather a lot of police and to keep big crowds under control and so on. So then governments start to develop somewhat other fisheries regulations. They introduce new fisheries laws, which provide space for small-scale fisheries in inshore zones, for instance. And these laws on paper, they look quite nice. But on the ground, you see that they are well, often not followed. They are not implemented as they should be. At the same time, you see, and this is a process I find interesting, that a kind of process of accommodation, that small-scale fishers who first protest very vigorously against all these things happening in their environments, which really affect them in a big way, that they start, also adjusting their lives. Also, the large-scale fishers, for instance, start adjusting. They help to take small-scale fishers to the fishing grounds. Small-scale fishers can help them offload their catches. There's different ways in which some kind of accommodation within the fisheries itself takes place. And that translates also into relationships between their legal systems. So in the South India case, it is the small-scale fishers, they have their village councils. The large-scale fishers also have their associations with their own, let's say, legal ramification. And you have, because of the conflict between the two, there are regular kind of interaction. So now there's a very regular practices built up of small-scale fishers. If a large-scale boat has cut through the nets, they will collect the evidence. They know exactly what to do. They need to go there and there. They have to take the torn nets and bring it there. The large-scale fisher court, let's say, will look at the evidence, make a judgment. There will be agreement or disagreement. So there's a process of accommodation which is definitely taking place to a large extent. To what extent mutual support is taking place depends also on the so between customary law and state law, there are certain measures in any case which both sides can agree on. But so, for instance, the fact that there's a closed fishing season for trawlers on the west coast of India in a certain period, and same for the east coast, that small-scale fisher councils will also agree with this, but they will also vigorously say this is only for the industrial boats. We are not going to go for a closed season. So, but I do think, so just generally speaking, that some of the things which started as enormous conflicts have kind of, whether they have mellowed, I don't know, but there's certainly a process of accommodation which has occurred.
Mm. Yeah, well, I mean, that's really interesting. And so what I gather from your response is that this typology is a very interesting entry point, but behind it is actually a bit more of a dynamic continuum of accommodation shifting back and forth. And so that's an interesting way to look at it. Anyway, very helpful. Thank you.
We have a couple more.
Okay, there's probably one last question from Sehu Akintola.
We have a question from Ms. Akintola from Nigeria about religious practices boosting production. And I'm not quite sure what you mean by your question, but I understand that you're also wondering to what extent you should take such religious practices seriously. And so seriously, you can do in two ways. You can say, okay, we realize that this is part of fisher life, and these religious practices are there, and that they have important meaning for fishers, and that they help them to make sense of their lives and also of their fishing practices. That is a different thing than saying, okay, we accept that religious rituals will actually boost, let's say, the productivity of inshore fishing regions. But so I think in this case, you would also, as in a co-management context, you would want to take these religious practices seriously, but also connect it in some way to, let's say, scientific evidence, to find ways of moving things forward in a way that that people feel themselves taken seriously. I think that is an important starting point also for legal pluralism. I hope this helps. I don't know.
Okay, so I think we are going to bring this to an end, because we are at time. I would like to thank Martin today for really an interactive, session, presenting a wonderful topic and bringing us examples and engaging with our audience. So unfortunately, there was no direct interaction, but I think the questions were really marvelous and generated interesting discussions. We'll continue this discussion through other forums of the V2B Global Partnership. But thank you very much, Martin, for making time and bringing your knowledge and expertise to our partnership through the webinar series itself. Before we conclude, I would request Simar to bring up the poster for next month's webinar talk, which is going to be by Maria Jose Barragan. And Maria is going to be talk on a topic that is titled as Governance Reflections about the Paradise, Crisis and Opportunities in the Galapagos Island. Maria is currently in the Charles Darwin Research Center on the Galapagos Island, right there. And we look forward to the interesting talk that she is going to bring on the last Friday, which is the June 25th, next month, of course. Please join us for that using the same link that is available to you. And thank you once again to everyone, our speaker, the audience, and everybody that supported the organization of this thematic webinar series of the B2B Global Partnership. Thank you very much once again. Bye-bye.